Hi everybody, welcome to our second podcast, and it's part 2 of our Cult Leaders feature.
Part 2.
And it was based on the poll that we put in our Facebook group, and also I just wanted to say thanks again for everyone who's participating in the group. We love it. We love to see you there. We're hoping you're coming on over to YouTube to also see our videos.
Thank you very much.
Speaking of which, I just want to start with a bit of a giveaway. I mentioned this giveaway on the Facebook group. Now I'm going to give you the details. So all we want you to do is to leave a comment under this video on YouTube. And what we have here, we have official OPP merch that we got at the OPP Museum. So we have a nice baseball cap and crime scene tape lanyard, and it's a very, very good lanyard, like super strong. So if you would like to win these things, please just comment below and we'll leave it go for about 2 weeks and we'll announce the winner. Thank you so much, guys.
That looks like
another thing I wanted to mention, did everybody see in the news headlines that Paul Bernardo was moved from maximum security prison to a medium security prison in Quebec? So this is fairly interesting. Usually we don't hear anything about him. And I'm not even sure why they're moving him from a maximum to a medium. So we're going to keep an eye on this. Definitely we're going to be covering that whole situation on our podcast at some point, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
But we're going to keep an eye on this and see how it develops, because that's a very interesting. Another point, also, they did not inform the family members of the victims, so, and that's a big no-no. That's huge. Actually, they should have known before even the media knew that it happened.
Yeah, that's kind of the weirdest thing, right?
Yeah, it's horrible, and I couldn't even imagine what they're going through right now knowing this. He was housed in Ontario, and as I mentioned, he's going to be moved to Quebec, so we shall see what happens. For those of you who aren't aware of the Bernardo case, we will be covering, as I said, but basically he is just a brutal monster.
He did some bad things.
Yeah, he did some horrible, horrible things. It sort of hit close to home here. If anybody was living in Ontario at the time, you know, it was a very, very big deal, and it was very, very scary. It happened to happen when I was a teenager. So we'll definitely keep an eye on it and look forward to a podcast about Paul Bernardo in the future.
Yeah, we'll keep up for any updates and we'll let you guys know.
Definitely, because it's a little... I'm actually kind of shocked by it. I'm not sure why it's affecting me so much. It just seems very, very sneaky. So in that poll, you voted number 1, the Manson family. So that's where we're going to start today. Now, the podcast is going to be about Canadian true crime, so definitely looking at Canadian cases. The reason that we did such a general video before is just to sort of test the waters, and so far so good, and thank you everyone who watched the first part of the podcast.
Yeah, it's doing well.
It is doing well for a channel that's only a few weeks old. We're very, very happy about it, so thanks again. But there is Canadian connection to the Manson family. There was a Canadian member of the Manson family. Now, I didn't really even know about this until recently, and I thought I learned quite a lot about the Manson family before. Her name was Ruth Ann Morehouse. She was born 1953 in Toronto. In 1970, so this is going through the trial at the end, she was accused of plotting to kill fellow Manson family member Barbara Hoyt in order to prevent her from testifying against Charles.
Very illegal.
Yeah. She was one of the followers that carved a swastika onto her forehead, and down the road, 1975, she ended up having it surgically removed from her forehead. So Yeah, I would definitely do that.
Yeah, it's not a good look.
Definitely do that. Barbara Hoyt ended up sort of seeking immunity in exchange for information to keep Charles Manson in prison because, not to jump ahead too much, but Charles wasn't, he didn't commit the murders, but they had to do what they could to legally keep him in prison. So a couple of his members actually turned against him. One was Barbara Hoyt, the most known, and so this Toronto gal, Ruth, hardcore follower, plotted to kill her to stop her from talking about Charles.
And again, it's weird. Even the last case we talked about with Rock Thériault, they'll talk about these religious motives and being told by God to do things, and you wonder why they never question why they're killing people, doing all these monstrous things.
Well, because these men are so dynamic, these cult leaders. You kind of, if you catch people at the right time, if you catch people in the middle of their suffering or when they're at their most vulnerable, you just got to strike the right nerve and keep on it. That's what makes these people, like these men, so, like, it's interesting, but it's also, it's sort of disgusting in a way that they would do that. Kick you when you're down, sort of, and take advantage of you.
Yeah, pretty much. And there's also usually drugs involved too. Either
they all use drugs. Yeah. Well, definitely Manson. Like, it was just at that time.
Yeah.
It was at the peak of drug use. So another Canadian connection. This one is directly to Charles Manson. I'm not sure how this happened. In 2009, Charles, obviously he was in prison. He was caught using a contraband cell phone, and he used to keep it under his pillow. So, and he used it to contact somebody in British Columbia, and it was for a number of times. Unsure who the person is, but it was traced. These phone calls were traced to British Columbia. So interesting. That's in 2009.
I wonder if it was like an old member that escaped, maybe to BC, or
could be like a new. Who knows? Could have been a woman. Yeah. I'm not 100% on that, but yeah. So there's that. Also, a case you all may be aware of, although it's up until most recently, there hasn't been that many details on it. So in November 1969, close to Mulholland Drive, so very, very close to the other murders, this woman's body was found. She was labeled a Jane Doe for many, many years, actually up until most recently. So she has been identified as Rita Jurvetson of Montreal, Quebec. And it's being suggested now that she is another victim of the Manson family. So, and this is very recent development. So I guess at this point, there's nothing legally that could be done because, of course, Charles is no longer with us. Yeah. But I guess it's great for the family to know what actually happened to her.
Wasn't it after the forensic investigation, I guess she died in a similar way to most of their victims, right?
She was stabbed to death numerous times. Just somebody just went wild there. All we know about that case so far is that she had met, I don't know how, especially back in the day, I guess had some sort of pen pal relationship, and then it was on the phone, like telephone relationship with a man named John in California. Short-term relationship before this. And that's how she ended up going from Montreal to how she ended up in California, in the hills, because she was meeting with this guy, but...
And not a lot of details to go on either to find this guy. John in California, that's pretty...
No, there was nothing about any John. Nobody knew him. Nobody even knew that she was really going to California. It was... Yeah. So that was... That's sort of what's also leading them to believe that it had something to do with Charles Manson. There must have been a financial connection there, or... Not sure. There will be more details, and maybe we'll bring it up in a podcast a little bit later on if we hear of anything. Because now that the family knows that it is her, maybe they'll start piecing things together, or, I mean, maybe.
Huh.
Maybe.
Could do. Probably has something to do with drugs, maybe. I'm not going to say that's what it is. I don't know, but...
Hey, well, if anything, the common thread here through through all of Manson's life is that he would do whatever he had to do to get money.
Yeah.
So, I have a feeling it had something to do with money. Maybe she was going to join them. I don't know, but we'll let you know if we hear anything.
Yeah, we'll keep you updated. Okay, so, November 12th, 1934, Charles was born to Kathleen Maddox. She got pregnant at an early age of 15 after she ran away from home. So shortly after he was born, she married a fellow named William Manson. Didn't take very long, the marriage to last, but they both ended up taking his last name, and of course that's how he became known as Charles Manson.
So that's where Manson comes from, so he would have been Charles Maddox.
Yes. So when Charles was young, his mother, she didn't have a lot of interest in being a mother. She had a problem with alcohol. She ended up spending most of the time in jail while he was younger. A lot of his memories is just visiting her in jail.
And it's always there's a mother problem in there, usually.
No.
Usually a mother problem. Definitely always a parent issue. But I mean, with these fellas, it's always about the mom.
Usually the mother, yeah. And with good reason with Charles, really. When he was just a toddler, she ended up trading him for a pitcher of beer.
Well, yeah.
Which, that's pretty desperate for beer, to trade your child for that. But luckily his uncle intervened and ended up rescuing him pretty shortly after, I believe.
Yeah, it didn't take long for them to find him. All they had to do was basically find the waitress, and then... So they got him back. He ended up living with his uncle for a little while.
Yeah, actually most of the time when he was younger, since his mom couldn't really take care of him, he ended up kind of just being passed around most of his relatives.
Yeah, very, very bad. Charles had I can say out of all the cult leaders that I know of, he had a very, very bad childhood in comparison to Rock Terrio and Jim Jones, who had, well, I mean, mostly normal upbringing.
Yeah.
Fairly uneventful. I mean, a few weird things. Not going to say there wasn't anything strange there. Yeah. And the families were always known to be very weird people. But I mean, still, like, there was... The parentals were there, but I mean, compared to Charles, who basically has been passed around since he was a baby.
Yeah, well, even the relatives, too, that he spent time with probably made things pretty rough for him. Like, at one point he was with his grandmother. She was a religious fanatic, which also could have led to some of his thoughts later on, maybe. One of his uncles, I don't know, was it the one he stayed with? Or he stayed with both, but...
It was another. He had a few uncles. It was a larger family on his mom's side.
Yeah, well, he ridiculed him for being too feminine, which, unfortunately, at that time, society wasn't that understanding. So, to him, that would have been a bad thing.
That would have hurt. Especially for someone who was, like, had zero self-esteem anyway.
Yeah.
So, to hear that, and then back in that time when men were men, and women were... nothing, basically. That must have been hard on him. Really hard. You don't want that going around about you. Whether it's true or not, you don't want that going around because you don't want to be known as that.
Yeah. And one of his other uncles, while he was in his custody, his uncle ended up taking his own life, which kind of left him floating around, I guess. He didn't really have a place to be, place to go. Until he was 9 years old, he was reunited with his mom. And then that's kind of when the crimes started taking over. He started his own criminal career.
Yeah.
So to speak.
Yeah. He was... And only at 9 years old, not even to double digits yet. And already you're kind of having to do for yourself. His mom was basically useless.
Yeah. And Even at 9 years old, he landed himself in a reformatory school for some of his crimes. Which, that's an early age to get started in that system. Like you said, not even double digits. And he's already landed himself in some sort of correctional facility, so to speak.
Yes, and it's really, really sad. Although that was the thing you did, reform school, and then it was, I mean, there are other ways of dealing with kids, but reform school was such a horrific experience for him too, and it certainly just added to what was already happening in his life. He was abused by, I guess, whoever the authorities are at the reform school, and even by other kids that were there.
So basically, like, no matter where he went, somebody was taking advantage of him or beating him down, pretty much, which obviously didn't help to what ended up happening. In the end, led to it, almost.
He was bullied. I guess he was kind of bullied. Really.
Yeah, from birth, pretty much.
From birth, yeah.
But most of his years, again, in his formative years, he was going in and out of reformatory schools. He'd be let out, more crimes, back to reformatory school, or he'd even escape.
Yeah, just a total vicious cycle. And this is another common thread through all of these cult leaders, is just this vicious cycle of things that happen to them. It is over and over repeated, like they don't learn their lesson, or
they just can't seem to help themselves, like they're just compelled.
No.
Then when he was 17, Charles stole a car. He drove across state lines, which would land him in federal prison. During that time, he racked up 8 assault charges until he was transferred to another facility. I guess they were tired of dealing with him.
Yeah, you get into fights all the time. And I think the way that he put it, you probably all know that he was interviewed just numerous times through the years. And he had mentioned a couple times that, yes, he got these assault charges, but he had to stand up for himself. He was still sort of, I don't know if he's playing a forever victim. Now that I think of it, he said, I was being picked on all the time. Yes, he definitely was through life, but I wonder if he was just saying that. But anyway, he did rack up those charges, but he said it was self-defense. Which, maybe.
Yeah. Well, maybe. I mean, after all those years of being, pestered and bullied by people in various ways, you wouldn't really be surprised if he's going to have an outburst or just kind of suddenly be tired of it and just decide to do something. It would make you an angry person.
I feel like it was like a survival, right?
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of those prisons, especially, I mean, I'm not going to say especially in America, but that's where you hear of it most.
Yeah. So, I mean, a bit of a plot twist. So, 1954, when he turned 19, he was released on parole after he had an unusual period of good behavior.
Unusual.
That's what I mean, like plot twist, right? You don't really see that coming.
Yeah, and you kind of, I guess maybe he just wasn't fighting anymore. I wonder if he sort of helped. Did he work in the cafeteria? Like, what did he do to be good?
Well, I don't know. It's not like he would have become a counselor or something, like...
I don't know.
Well, I don't know.
I don't know what his good behavior was, but it allowed him to be released on parole, which that's, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Maybe
good deal for him.
Maybe it could be like he was trying to take on a religious attitude. Like I said, his mother was a religious fanatic. Maybe he pulled some memories out of his head and started reading the Bible.
He was playing them.
Oh, probably.
Big time. I think by this time he was already so like street smart and, spending so much time in, with these other criminals or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, especially, he learned a thing or two,
Yeah, we already knew how to manipulate, so, people like that can tend to, be well-behaved just to accomplish their own means.
Absolutely.
It's not beyond them.
Absolutely.
So, about a year after that, March 1956, he had met a waitress named Rosalie Willis, and they ended up moving to California together. Surprise, surprise, in a stolen car.
Yeah. So he just doesn't want to buy a car.
No, I guess I don't know what it was.
He wants cars, but he doesn't want to actually buy the cars.
Yeah. He obviously doesn't have that much I don't want to say respect or, obviously they don't hold that much meaning for him because he just steal, ditch, whatever.
Yeah, he's never really, I guess he never cared about possessions that much. They got married too.
Yeah, and about a year later they gave birth. She gave birth to Charles Manson Jr. And during that time, once again, Charles was arrested for stealing yet another car. And he had 3 years in Terminal Island Prison in San Pedro. And that's when Rosalie decided to divorce him.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's not going to change.
Yeah, no, that's good for her because, the same thing happened to Roctario. When he first went to jail, that's when his wife decided to leave him too and take their son. Very similar there.
Yep.
Never thought about that.
I guess that's... I don't know. After so many times of getting in trouble, going to prison, when you're married to somebody, eventually you'd be like, it's not worth it.
I don't know. It's been done. When there's a lot of women out there whose husbands or boyfriends have gone to jail or gone to prison and they've sort of hung in there for them, but no, it all depends on the situation.
Yeah.
Some women just can't. And in all fairness, if the guy's being put away for a long time, I don't know.
Yeah, especially if you got a newborn or a fairly young child. And at the time, like you said, too, women sort of just starting to come into the workforce, like being allowed a little more freedom. It would have been hard for her to keep the child going on her own.
I think she was just tired of living a life of crime, because if he's stealing cars, there's a lot of other stuff going on. And I didn't I didn't delve into it too much. It is what it is. He was who he was. He was a criminal, and probably that's why she was just, okay, here's my chance to get away. And with a kid, you don't want to have a child with someone and you're, like Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah. You
know what I mean? That doesn't work.
No.
So no doubt.
Bonnie and Clyde plus child or something
no,
like that,
can
right?
you? No, can't happen. So yeah, I can see why she divorced him.
Okay, so in 1958, then Charles was released from prison, and he ended up pimping in Hollywood, and that's where he actually met one of his girls, Leona Stevens, also known as Candy. They had one child together. They called him Charles Luther Manson. But eventually, Candy also got sick of Charles, and she ended up divorcing him in 1963.
Yeah, just not wanted, eh? That was his thing. I wasn't wanted anywhere, so whatever, I don't care
Might as
anymore.
well start pimping, I guess.
Oh, it's sad if you think about it, though. I know he is who he is, but it's sad to think about somebody not feeling wanted since they were, a baby. Well, he wasn't even wanted when he was a baby.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's just, you hate to say it's sad, but it is kind of sad.
Yeah. Well, and even, if not that you can really put a monetary value or a value on people, but, traded for a pitcher of beer. Something that lasts, probably with his mom's problem, a couple minutes. And that was his lifetime. She was just giving away,
yeah,
just for that.
So unfortunate. And it's too bad his family didn't seem to really have their crap together either. I don't know. As far as we know, anyway, he didn't have very much nice to say about his family.
No.
For sure.
No, I think what Charles had said is when he visited his mom in prison once, she gave him one hug. And that was, I think, the only hug he ever got.
Yeah.
Or at least the only love he ever felt.
Until later on.
Yeah.
So it's no wonder. So now we're seeing why what happened had happened, having all these women in his life, and it boosts his confidence, and he's getting more than hugs, but you know what I mean? Yeah. He was getting that love.
Yeah.
I guess. At his command, basically.
Yeah. And so while he was still married to Candy, June 1960, he was arrested once again. He was charged with crossing the state lines with the intent to prostitution. He'd eventually get a 7-year sentence to be served at McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington State. And during this time, he began studying Scientology and music. And,
that's interesting.
Yeah,
Scientology.
Scientology had only been around for almost 10 years by this point.
Yeah.
As most people know, it was started by an L. Ron Hubbard. It was supposed to be a self-help system at first, which, when you think about, we're not going to get into that, but when you think about the belief system, you got to question how it's self-help. But
Yeah, and a lot of these cults are actually based around self-help systems. Rock Terrio, for example, if you didn't see the first one, go and check it out. But he had opened a clinic, and it was basically like, it wasn't self-help, but it was, I mean, there was some self-help aspects to it. So his sort of cult started from self-help. Also, in the, well, most recent times, Nexium, which we're not going to talk about, but that was another sort of self-help system that went terribly wrong, and that's in modern times. So interesting how they all come from that.
yeah, I mean, another thing too that was pretty popular at the time, which usually goes along with self-help, I guess in the 60s at least, was music. It started to become more popular with the younger crowd sort of expressing themselves a little more. So Charles became obsessed with performing and practicing his own music a lot while he was in prison. He wrote dozens of songs, and then he ended up singing them by himself as well, and he had, I would say, delusions that he was going to be a famous musician once he got out of prison. Probably because, like I said, society at the time, it was all about expressing yourself in various ways.
Yeah, it was actually allowable in music. Before that, music was very mainstream and very vanilla, I guess. But I mean, later on, look at all the great folk music that came out of the 60s, and it was all very political and about the war and about just the times. And so we were getting into that, and Charles loved this idea. Although he really did not care for the hippie culture. And he expressed that a number of times.
Yeah.
But he felt it was an opportunity to sort of mix into a big crowd, and he was going to get the ladies with his music and with the drugs. It wasn't about being a hippie. He never was, and he never liked it. But he felt it was an opportunity for him to manipulate. So,
and just as an example of how things were changing during the 60s, I know that Jimi Hendrix, before he made a big name for himself, he'd been going around playing guitar for a few different types of band, mostly blues, some rock and roll, but a lot of the times people didn't want to work with him because he expressed himself too freely. And of course he was one of the bigger names in that generation where music started changing.
Yeah.
But he just was getting too out there for a lot of people, so of course once he made a name for himself, everything started changing.
Yeah, and it was actually, like, I guess, he had a bit of a following. He was known, but he was very much embraced by the hippie culture. So, this is where sort of it's all going. The music is it's going that way. So Charles, he was looking at it, and he was excited.
Yeah.
He was excited.
He had a lot of thoughts mulling around in his brain, of course, in prison, so what better way to express himself with this idea that he was going to make a big name for himself.
Yeah, and that's how he ended up in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco in 1967 during the Summer of Love. So there we go. His plans coming together.
He escaped. Well, he didn't escape, but once he got out of prison, it was March 21st, 1967, in the epicenter of the hippie movement. Free love, after pimping and everything in the 50s where things was all restricted.
It's perfect for him.
Yeah. So, of course,
perfect.
He slipped right in there. He was using his music and lots of drugs. He started to develop his following. And that would be about the beginning of the Manson family.
So now Charles is, he's out and about. He's mixing in with the hippies. And the Manson family's about to come together. Real quick.
And start making his clan.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And it's going to build. So the first member of the Manson family was Mary Brunner. So she think she was really a hippie, but I guess that she was in the midst of the culture. She was a librarian at the University of California, Berkeley campus, so yeah, when it was prevalent there, obviously.
It's especially around universities and colleges at that time was when a lot of the hippies started to come out because they're intelligent people.
Yeah, yeah, and especially in California.
Yeah.
So they got to know each other, and she actually invited Charles to go and live with her. And she quit her job. She started doing a lot of drugs with Charles, and she just became a full-time follower.
That must have been pretty disappointing to her parents at the time, too. She had a good job.
Well, this just goes to show this is the first follower, and already he's got her just like that. A woman, an independent woman, working a very, very good job. And she just quit her job and just became a full-time follower. After that, Lynette Fromm joined Mary and Charles, so we know her as Squeaky Fromm. The Manson family consists of approximately 100 members over time, and he was becoming even well known outside of his family. He was sort of out there as a guru in San Francisco, so he was getting well known in the entire community.
And again, that leads to what you were saying about they always seem to put themselves out there as some kind of guru or spiritual leader or somebody who can show you the way.
That was the time, right? Yeah. I mean, the Beatles were the ones who started it, sort of, with gurus and bringing the spirituality, bringing Hinduism into America through their music, and especially through George Harrison. And actually, speaking of George Harrison and the hippie culture, George Harrison had mentioned before that he was super interested in the hippie culture. Of course, he was over in England. So when he came to America, he ended up going to the Haight-Ashbury district. And of course, he was super popular there, and they were, shocked. Oh my goodness, George Harrison. And he hung out for a little bit and played music, and he thought they were fairly nice people, but he said the hippie culture is not what I thought it was.
Yeah, I think it was, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, they experimented with drugs over in England there, the Beatles. But I think there was something about the hippie culture in California that he wasn't quite keen on. It was either the drugs or the free love, I think. Because I don't think they were really free love kind of guys.
The Beatles?
Yeah.
Oh, sure they were.
Well,
they were, but I mean, I think because George had become new, at the time it was new into Hinduism, so I think he was sort of, his morals and values were sort of changing, but I think he kind of, not in so many words, sort of hinted toward the fact that these are just a bunch of addicts and junkies. Like, it's not the political feel or the spiritual feel that I thought it was. He said they're literally, like, this district is the hub of the hippie movement, but look at them. They're bums on the street. It was getting out of hand. Like, I don't think it was meant to be a long-term way of life.
Yeah, I don't think so. And especially, like, if you get into that kind of lifestyle and you're spiritual, you're not really about abusing your energies, especially sexual energies.
Yeah, well, I think that had a lot to do with how George felt about that. Yeah. Anyway, I thought that was interesting because, I've always felt very drawn to the hippie culture. I love it. I love the music. I love the vibe and the look. But the more you learn about the actual culture, not everywhere, but in the hubs, like what is considered the hubs of the culture, the more you see that it's a lot of shadiness. And a lot of it wasn't all good times. It wasn't all happy. There was a number of crimes that took place in the late 60s had almost everything to do with the hippie culture. It was either hippies that were involved or people that were against hippies at the time. So, yeah.
It's usually drug fueled too. That was the thing when they start getting to the heavier things. Stuff like weed, not so much the cause of it, but...
Back then, maybe, though. It's easy for us to say now about that because it's almost basically legal everywhere. But back in the day, it would have been a hot commodity. And also to mention that the hippie culture and the biker culture at the time intermingled a lot.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and that was in the late 60s. So by the end of the Summer of Love, Charles and some of the women lived and traveled around an old school bus. So it was one of the, like a hippie van kind of thing. They later on settled in the Los Angeles area of Topanga Canyon, Malibu, and Venice. So they were on the road. Mary Bronner became pregnant by Charles. So she was the librarian. And his third son would be born. So this is the third son who basically never had a father.
Yeah.
But, it's these sort of, the cult leaders like to have the children. They like to at least make the children and say, I'm the father of, so many. Like even Jim Jones, most of his kids were adopted, but he was always like, look at my large family.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So this is where it's going with Charles.
I think that's a thing. Well, though I don't know. It could be women too, but I guess it would be like narcissistic tendencies where you feel like all these people have to depend on you, or like, look at me, I'm, I have all these people under my wing, so to speak, and
yeah,
people rely on me, I'm important, that kind of thing.
Well, that mentality it's definitely a thing. Not just cult leaders, but there's, even in the business world, I guess you can say there are people that are at the top and it's like, look at all the people who work under me. Yeah. It's just like, it's the personality of the person.
Yeah.
I think. That's what it comes down to. So eventually they all moved into a condemned house in Topanga Canyon. Mary had the child in that house. And she didn't go to the hospital. She ended up having the other family members, the other ladies, help her with the birth. So it's a little scary, but...
I think that was the only child not called Charles, too, wasn't it? His name was Valentine?
Yeah, that's a whole other thing. And I didn't actually think about that until recently, that he was naming all his kids Charles Manson, basically.
Actually, too, I remember... was one of Jim Jones' children. Well, there's Jim Jones Jr., I think, and then his other son I saw was called Tim Jones.
Yeah, so I might as well.
Yeah, I might as well, because of course people are going to hear that and be like, oh, it's almost like Jim Jones.
Yeah.
And be like, funny story, actually.
Yeah, and when I was sort of looking into Jim's children, because on the last podcast we mentioned that his kids were not affected by the mass life-taking. They had all lived on. And none of them changed their name. I thought they would have after that.
You'd think so.
Especially being, a Jim Jones Jr., Jim Jones at all. And mostly, is that name, he had a few sons named after him. So they didn't end up changing their name.
I'm not an expert on surnames, but there's certain names like that, like Jim Jones, Charles Manson.
We have a friend named Charles Manson.
Yeah.
Charles, if you're watching this. So Charles has gotten known in the San Francisco area, playing music around. He has all these ladies, newborn son. He starts mixing in with celebrities. So, he's living in Hollywood for a while there, too. So I guess naturally.
Well, he made quite a name for himself already as a guru.
Yeah.
And I think it was his followers believed that they were the reincarnation of the early Christians, and that, the establishment was the Romans. So, he kind of used that as a point, what do you call that? Point of contention?
Yeah.
To sort of, and again, that's a popular thing in cults. It's us against them. So, at this point, he was already making a name for himself with the hippies. And there were some famous people who were into that scene, too, so...
Yeah, and he was even sort of making himself look kind of like Jesus, in a way, like how you would picture someone who was nearer to God, or... Yeah, so he was, The hair and the mustache. I guess Jesus had a mustache and a beard, I'm assuming. But yeah, he was sort of taking on, so he was looking like that role too. So very well known. So actor Al Lewis, you probably remember him as Grandpa Munster in the original series of the Munsters. So somehow he allowed Charles Manson and the family to babysit his kids a number of times too. And Al Lewis claimed that Charles was a nice guy when I knew him.
Yeah, which I mean, I don't know, after everything started coming out, you gotta wonder, was he like, wow, sorry kids, like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how young his kids were at the time, but
I don't know how he even got in connection with Al Lewis, unless Al Lewis, Grandpa Munster, was he involved in the hippie scene somehow, or had, like, I never found how they were connected. And the only reason I know about this is because during the trial, like I'd mentioned earlier, they wanted to solidify Charles staying in prison. They had to have a good reason. And they wanted him in there for a very, very long time because they knew he was super influential. So they would talk to celebrities that knew him. Because I guess celebrities are considered to be a higher authority than your average Joe. So they were talking to the celebrities that he knew. And this is when actor Al Lewis had said, he used to babysit my kids.
Yeah. And that, I mean,
and he was a nice guy.
Yeah. And that kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a job, but if you trust someone to babysit your kids, usually means they're a good person, right? Or at least you can trust them.
It says a lot. Either it says a lot about the family at the time, or it says a lot about Al Lewis.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. Charles was also close to Phil Kaufman. So Phil Kaufman was a very well-known music producer. He worked with the Rolling Stones and Frank Zappa. So that end of the music spectrum. He introduced Charles to Gary Stromberg, who was a movie producer with Universal Studios. So Gary Stromberg was another one who they had interviewed to sort of get, I guess, character witness about Charles Manson. And he said Charles had a dynamic personality and was able to read a person's emotional weaknesses and manipulate them.
Which...
pretty bang on, I'd say.
Yeah. And I mean, I know too from, like, if you're, I don't know, obviously he didn't get much schooling back in the day, but a lot of the things he would have learned would be from observation, I would think. Especially if he's got a lot of people who don't want him, probably didn't want him to talk a lot, you know, if they didn't want him around, didn't like him. So he would have spent a lot of time observing.
I was thinking that too. It's kind of, he would learn from the best of the best, because even when he was in reform school or even in prison and he just really didn't want to bother with anyone, he would hear and see things and he would just be taking it all in. Yeah. So he's kind of like a super criminal in a sense.
Super criminal.
Well, you know what I mean? Like, he's...
Yeah, I mean, that's the only people who probably would have wanted to talk to him would have been criminals.
Pure street smarts. Not so much education-wise, but I mean, street smarts all the way.
Yeah.
So, and of course, the biggie, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. So one night, it was in the spring of 1968, Dennis Wilson was driving down the street, going home. He ended up picking up two of Manson's followers. So that was Patricia Krenwinkel and Ella Jo Bailey. They were hitchhiking. So he picked them up. They spent a few hours with him. They were drinking, doing LSD. They ended up spending the night at Brian Wilson's home. So Brian left in the morning. I guess he had, he was going to the studio and, whatever else.
Doing Beach Boy stuff.
Doing the thing. And in the evening, when he came back home, he was greeted in the driveway by Charles Manson and approximately 12 strangers inside the house, mostly women. So I guess one of the girls who spent the night with Dennis Wilson must have called Charles and said, "Hey, guess where we are? Dennis Wilson's mansion.
Yeah.
Come on over." And Charles just sort of went there, and he said to Dennis, "Is it okay if we crash here and we have all these women, we'll just party and hang out and talk about music." And
Yeah.
Dennis was like, "Okay."
Well, and that, with Charles's aspirations to be a musician, hell, he just landed himself right in Dennis Wilson's apartment.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. And Dennis Wilson, well, the Beach Boys themselves, Brian Wilson too, just phenomenal songwriters, and Charles thought he was a great songwriter, and the Beach Boys were being recognized at this point in time as being very good songwriters. It wasn't just about it was going into more meaningful music, so who better to run into?
Yeah, for him. And then eventually, like over the next few months, the numbers of women were just doubling, and he was constantly having them there, and Charles and Dennis just kind of ended up having all these servants, serving them in many ways. And it just was a great time for them, I suppose. I don't know about the women. Probably, there was lots of alcohol and drugs involved, so everyone was enjoying themselves in some way.
Yeah, so Dennis just basically covered everything. And paying for everything, all their food, if the ladies wanted to go shopping. He figured it was about $100,000 he ended up spending in that amount of time, including a large medical bill, as gonorrhea had run rampant amongst them. So,
which I wonder if you got that too.
Oh, well, probably.
Yeah, I would think so.
They were all,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure.
Again, though, at that point, it was still a lot of free love going around.
Yeah, and everybody was having a good time.
Yeah.
Dennis Wilson also paid for studio time for Charles Manson to perform the songs that he had written. He introduced Charles to Greg Jacobson. So Greg Jacobson is the songwriting partner of Brian Wilson, of the Beach Boys, obviously. Terry Melcher, the producer of The Byrds, and Rudy Altobelli, he was the manager to the Stars and owner of 10050 Cielo Drive. So that is the location of you-know-what. And they were all fascinated by Charles Manson. They were very, very interested in him, and they kind of like to hang around with him. Although later on that is going to change. Because he started harassing them too. He had all these great connections, and had he done the right thing and just worked with them, not against them, maybe he would have actually had a hit or two. But he kind of was forcing them, record me and put me out there. And then it was record me and put me out there or else. It was getting really where they had to sort of back off from him.
Well, and that's where you got to wonder what was more important to him. He thought he could have a amazing musical career, but to treat these people like that who could have given him a chance, you'd think he'd want to play it cool, try and be, keep everything all sweet between them. But
yeah, I think it's just he had a bit of an anger issue there. I think that certainly didn't help, because he was smart enough to know he had a very good opportunity here.
Yeah, well, and his ego too, right? It was, like I said, did he want a great musical career, or did he just want people to love and adore him and treat him like he's something special?
No, he wanted it all.
Yeah.
He wanted it all, and I think it was probably, he couldn't figure out, everybody loved him. Why don't you love me? It's me. Record me.
Yeah, exactly. Don't you know who I am?
I am a winner. I am a winner. I'm a sure bet.
And I think that's also stems from the way he was treated when he was younger. Because he had these high, held himself in pretty high regard, thinking he was something special. And, sometimes if people don't get treated like that when they're younger, they put it out there, even if it's not true. They say, don't you know who I am or what I do?
Yeah. Rock Terrio used that to manipulate some people when he was first forming his following. He would sort of put the little things out to people in conversation. Oh, when I was a child, this. Oh, no, poor you. And you've overcome that?
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And that, oh, I can manipulate people by telling them what a horrible childhood or whatever I had.
Yeah.
So Dennis Wilson had to move out of his home. He was only renting that home. And then the Manson family kind of hung around in the home, and the landlord came by and ended up kicking them out. Obviously, they couldn't live there anymore. One song by the Beach Boys that was written by Charles Manson, that was actually recorded, was titled Never Learn Not to Love. Charles, gave up his rights to that song right away in exchange for a bit of money. So, but there is that song. It does exist on an album.
Yeah, which is, again, that was the time, the free love hippie era, but coming from Charles Manson, never learned not to love, that was kind of something he said too. He'd never know all these positive feelings. People ask him if he felt remorse, but he doesn't even know what it is because he's never been treated with any sort of consideration by anyone. So how does he know what it's like to actually love or not to love?
He has an idea about it that he's gathered, I think, probably in things he's seen or in his own mind. I think he could never have a good, loving, marriage and be a family man or anything because he never got to see that, really.
Yeah.
And he talked about back in the day, even television shows like Leave It to Beaver or, with those perfect families, and he said, how can I identify with that? He said, that may have been a reality for some people, but not for me. He said, that can't be me. And I don't, not identifiable with that.
Yeah.
Which is sad.
Yeah.
Sad. I mean, a lot of us can't identify with Leave It to Beaver, but you know what I mean.
Good show.
It's, at the time, definitely a good show. Okay, so they are kicked out of the mansion.
That's, of course, when they end up at Spahn Ranch.
Yeah, infamous Spahn Ranch. So Spahn Ranch is a dilapidated Western movie set. So there were many, many movies and television shows that were filmed there. Bonanza being a big one. Little House on the Prairie was filmed near that area up on the hills. A lot of movies from the day too. But it had had its time. The owner was George Spahn. So he was about 80 years old, nearly blind. He allowed them to stay there and earn their keep. So they made money by selling horseback rides. Female family members did chores around the ranch, also sexual favors for Spahn himself, and that Charles made sure that happened. Actually, Squeaky Fromm got her nickname, Squeaky, from George Spahn. He was one of those dirty old men.
Basically.
Those dirty old men, Basically. So he used to, the story goes, she would sit on his knee, he would pinch her thigh, and she would let out a squeak every time he did it. And that's how she got her nickname Squeaky, because he used to pinch her and she'd squeak. So that's a bit of a sick fact. But that's where that name came from, in case you didn't know. So in March 1969, and as I mentioned before, Paul Melcher, the music producer, the talent manager, Rudy Altobelli, were sort of, they had distanced themselves from Charles for them. So he ended up at the home of Paul Melcher, which is that house at Cielo Drive. So he actually went to his house. Charles knocked on the door and was greeted by Sharon Tate's photographer and friend. Charles asked for Paul Melcher and was informed that he didn't live there anymore. And so this house now belonged to Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. And as you know, about that time, Roman Polanski wasn't even in the country at all when this had happened. So they were kind of, trying to get rid of him, more or less. Later that evening, Charles went back to Cielo Drive, and he was greeted by Rudy Altobelli, who informed him that Melcher had moved to Malibu, but he did not tell Charles where or give him an address. Because as I said, they were just done with him and he was getting a little scary.
Yeah, it's pretty pushy. Like, wow, that's beyond pushy. Showing up at the house and knocking on the door like that.
Manson family member Tex Watson became involved at this time in a drug dealing and robbed another drug dealer named Bernard Crowe. So Crowe responded to him saying, I'm going to kill everyone at Spahn Ranch, meaning the Manson family. So Tex called Charles and said, hey, I'm here with this guy. He said he's going to come down there and he's going to send his people after you and he's going to kill us all. And Charles said, you know what? No, that is not happening. So Charles Manson went over to his house and shot him, and that was July 1st, 1969. So that was actually, technically, as far as we know, the only person that Charles Manson has killed was Bernard Crowe.
It shows that he's capable of it anyway. Like, he at least did it once.
He went over and just shot him.
Yeah, but he didn't realize. Well, I mean, he thought that he accidentally killed a member of the Black Panthers, which that's what was stated by news reporters, that Crowe was a member of the Black Panthers, but it turned out he actually wasn't.
Yeah.
But Charles, of course, was afraid there was going to be some kind of retaliation from the Black Panthers because of that. And so they ended up turning Spahn Ranch into kind of a defensive camp, or fort.
So the paranoia is setting in. And we didn't mention it beforehand, but there's a whole situation of Helter Skelter. So, and a connection to the Beatles. So Charles felt that the album, in particular the song Helter Skelter, was a message being sent to him, warning of a racial tensions, possibly an all-out war, where the white people were at risk and people of color were going to take over, I guess. But he felt like he was getting that from the song.
Yeah, well, he thought it was going to be an apocalyptic race war.
Yeah, he's worried now.
Yeah.
He thought he messed with the wrong people. Actually, he didn't, but... So, and he was so worried that he brought in members of the Straight Satans, so... I'm not sure if you... Yeah, he had a very big association with the bikers, in particular the Straight Satans, and they acted sort of as his security guards at the ranch. Not too long after, Charles connected with a music teacher, Gary Allen Hinman, and they ended up going to stay at Gary's home. I guess they were worried, obviously, about being at the ranch with that threat. So they moved in with Gary. Charles thought that Gary was very wealthy. He actually really wasn't. He was just a very hard worker. I mean, he had his own home, but he really earned it. It's not like he had a lot of excess money or anything. So they lived with him for a little bit. And on July 25th, 1969, Charles sent a few of his family members over to Gary's place to convince him to join the family and turn over assets to them. So, give us all your money, sell your possessions, give us that money, come on the road with us, more or less, be part of the family. Yeah. The three family members ended up holding Gary hostage for 2 days. And Charles would show up every now and again, and he was checking on him. And he would harm Gary using a sword. So it was getting rough there. It was getting rough. He was paranoid, therefore his actions were getting worse. And this is sort of like Jim Jones in a way. Yeah, it was sort of, there's no looking back now. Yeah. It's either it happens or it doesn't happen. But Gary did not want to do it, and he was later killed by Bobby Beausoleil, a Manson family member. But Charles incited Bobby to do it. Charles didn't do it himself. And Bobby Beausoleil used Gary's blood to write "Political Piggy" on the wall and drew a panther paw, a Black Panther symbol. So he wanted to make it look like it was the crimes were done by the Black Panthers to put them in a bad light.
Try to incite the war that he thought was coming.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah. In August So about a month later, I believe, Bobby Beausoleil was arrested after he was caught driving Gary's car. And he was hiding the murder weapon in the wheel well. So even a month later, I'm surprised he didn't really get rid of it, but
Yeah.
driving around in his car with the murder weapon on him. So Bobby Beausoleil is done. Also in August, so this is a number of bad things happening all in one clump of time here. Charles ordered 4 of his followers to go to the Cielo Drive address and do away with the people that were inside. So I don't know, I guess just out of his frustration, maybe he still believed Paul Melcher was living there and he was just tired of being ignored. There are a number of things that drove him to incite this. But anyway, they went over there. This included actress Sharon Tate and her unborn baby and 4 others who were visiting her.
Yeah,
So, and we know what happened that night. We don't really have to get into the details, but it was horrific. That's August 9th. August 10th, Charles dropped off 7 of his family members at the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. So Charles is the driver. And this was his thing. All I did was drop them off.
Yeah.
I don't know what really happened there. I mean, eventually he did admit, yeah, I knew what happened, but at first he was like, I'm the driver. I'm dropping them off at a place. I don't know what they're doing. They could be going in there to hang out with them.
Yeah, he would always just say that they just did what they wanted. That didn't really have anything to do with him. Those people did what they wanted to do.
Yeah, so that's where the debate is. Like, even, I guess, to this day, to a certain extent, how much power did he have in it? Yeah, but according to him, he was just the driver.
And that could still be the manipulation tactics, too. He may not have, I don't know for sure, he may not have told them straight up to do it. But if he's saying that they did what they wanted to do, he could have planted it in their heads there and just left them to it because he already knew what was going to happen.
Well, the LaBiancas were bound, gagged, and stabbed to death. And at this point, like I said, Charles had just dropped off his followers, so he was long gone. Patricia Krenwinkel, one of the, well-known ladies, used their blood to write Rise and Death to Pigs on the walls and Helter Skelter on their fridge. So it took months to determine who was responsible for these murders. In December 1969, Charles and several of the family were arrested. So eventually it was brought right back to them. And I believe the way that happened was through witness accounts.
Family members, including Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, and Patricia Krenwinkel, were also sentenced to death.
Yeah, but they were saved from execution as the California Supreme Court outlawed the death penalty in 1972. So, of course, the trial went on for a while. Charles had a separate trial from the women, and, there was a separate one for Tex. So, by the time it was done, it was 1972, and by that time, the death penalty was done. So he ended up spending decades behind bars at California State Prison in Corcoran. And that's where he stayed basically up until the end of his life. Patricia Krenwinkel is still in prison, and she is up for parole in November of this year, 2023. Leslie Van Houten was denied parole over 20 times, and she was just denied again actually this month. Susan Atkins died in prison in 2009 of brain cancer. Tex Watson turned to religion while he was inside, so that's also quite common. They do that. He became a minister in prison. He also earned a business degree, and he is still incarcerated to this day. Clem Grogan, who's sort of not really the most known, but was sentenced to life, but he was paroled in 1985 after revealing to authorities the location of another murder victim. So Linda Kasabian, another very well-known member, did not participate in any of the murders. She was the lookout. So she turned state witness against the family and ended up testifying against them. So she was free to go. And I mean, I guess she didn't participate in the murders anyway, even though she was there.
Yeah.
And really, by law, that makes you almost as guilty as the person committing the crime.
But I mean, if you're a witness for the state, you know, you may not have participated, but you knew exactly what was going on. So, I don't know. It kind of...
It was they made a deal with her. I mean, she was fully into it. And Linda Kasabian was a member of the family for a long time.
Yeah.
It's sort of one of those deals with the devil sort of thing. Squeaky Fromm also did not participate in any of the murders. She also stayed very, very devoted to Charles while he was in prison. But in September 1975, she was arrested for pulling a gun on then U.S. President Gerald Ford and convicted of attempted assassination on the president.
Big no.
So, yeah. She was sentenced to life in prison. In 1987, she escaped from a West Virginia prison in an attempt to visit Charles. So this is Squeaky. So she's super devoted to him.
Yeah. Super
devoted, where she would break out of prison. But the reason why was because she had found out that Charles had developed cancer. A thing about the cancer, you've heard, and we've just talked about a handful of his family members. So a lot of his family members have developed cancer or have died of cancer, and Charles too, of course. And a lot of people believe it's where they lived on Spahn Ranch. So Spahn Ranch, as I said before, was a movie set, and that particular chunk of land was used for nuclear testing back in the day. And we had mentioned, Bonanza and Little House on the Prairie and some of the, movies and television shows that were filmed there on that set. Now, a good majority of those actors and actresses actually developed cancer, and some survived, but mostly passed away from cancer. And it all had to do with that land. And it didn't actually come out until much later that this was the actual cause. It's factual.
Well, nuclear testing, yeah.
Yeah. And it was long after, definitely after Michael Landon passed away, that they'd found this out. They did soil testing, and they said, oh, this is probably why they all had cancer, was because of being there. And so Spahn Ranch obviously is in the midst of that. So I believe that's why, I guess, a number of the Manson family members ended up having cancer. So
yeah, probably the same reason.
Yeah, it's sad to think about all the actors and actresses that had it from being on that land. Sick of the people that actually did know about it, because somebody knew.
Yeah.
The studios and whatnot. But anyway, that's just because I'm reading it off and I'm saying that word a lot. It's because of living on Spahn Ranch. So Squeaky was captured and in prison again until 2008. And in 2008, her parole was granted and she was released.
Once again, out into the public.
I don't know if that culture exists right now, the people who think the Manson family is cool, or... We live in a different time right now. He passed away on November 19th, 2017 of natural causes, but he was very ill. His last words were, "I am the most famous human being that has ever lived." I'm sure he's up there. I don't think he's the most famous, but
I'm sure
definitely known.
Yeah, pretty soon I think he won't be as well remembered. Not just because the generations would have, passed on in the future, but there's a lot of things even that have been in popular culture for the past, I guess 30, 40 years that some kids, like younger people, don't know about these days. I don't know. But with that being said, true crime is very, very popular. I've always been interested in true crime, but it's becoming more and more popular, so they will know about him. That is true.
I think he's an image, though, if anything. Really, when you think of Charles Manson, you sort of think about how he looks, not really what happened.
Yeah.
But he's an image, kind of like Jim Morrison, John Lennon. It's not that they're not legendary people. It's just they're images now. So I think, in my opinion, I don't think that there's. I think of a cult forms and they are saying they're Mansonites or whatever.
Yeah.
That's just weird. Because that whole vibe was gone a long time ago.
Yeah.
So that is the story of the Manson family. Thank you very much for being with us.
Yes, thanks, guys.
In the next little while, we will be working on Canadian true crime. We're looking at a story of a mob family who lived in Hamilton, Ontario. Also, the Black Donnellys. And we're trying to find something a little bit more special to do with the Black Donnelly story. So let's stay tuned. Don't forget to subscribe.
Subscribe and like.
Wherever the button over here or over here.
Over there? Is it over there?
Hit the button.
Yeah.
Please subscribe. We would appreciate that. Lots of content coming out. Thanks again to the Facebook group. Everyone who went over to Instagram. You're making a dream come true here. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us. And we'll see you next time.
All right. See you next time, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.